I'm going to give you some background on Romanesque art, and then we're going to discuss Romanesque pilgrimage churches. After the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, individual principalities were the norm. Only rarely, for example, the Ottonian Empire, were large parts of Europe ruled by a single monarch. The economic system was feudalism, based on a hierarchical class system of lords to whom vassals pledged fealty. The warrior class ruled and fought. The serfs worked the land. The idea of hierarchy was important in the Middle Ages. Heaven was a celestial hierarchy with God at the apex. The church was another hierarchy with the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as the head of the Western or the Latin Church. Conflict often arose between the king and pope as to whose authority should hold sway, both claiming to be divinely ordained for their office. Monasticism was a powerful institution, a community of persons who had taken religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who practiced communal living. In the West, most monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict and the liturgy of 8 canonical hours. Now, I should say a little bit about that. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, the rule of Saint Benedict held sway in the West, but gradually other monastic orders came into being with other rules. Although they all pledged poverty, chastity, and obedience, if they were monastic orders. And they generally followed the liturgy of 8 canonical hours. These are the divine office. They are prayers, readings from the Bible, Psalms, for example, the Gospels. And these are celebrated 8 times during the day or night. So every monk or every nun 8 times during the day would stop whatever they're doing, or if it's night, get up and go to the church and recite these prayers and readings. And this is part of the monastic order. This is part of the rule. Monks devoted their lives to work and prayer in obedience to their vows, the rule of the order, and their superiors in the church. The most direct superior would be the abbot or the prior. However, top-ranking monks often had contact with the outside world. Some were advisors to kings. Monasteries served as pilgrimage sites and lodging places for travelers. Some had schools and infirmaries that served the secular as well as religious communities. Donations of land and serfs. When you donate the land, the serfs come with it. Donations of land and serfs, plus other gifts, caused many of the monasteries to become self-sufficient or even extremely wealthy. Although the vows of poverty precluded individual ownership. At least that was how they justified it. You didn't own this for yourself, it was for the order. I should also talk to you about the difference between a monk and a priest. A priest is an ordained clergyman who is authorized to perform the sacraments. Most monks are not priests, although a monk could be ordained and be both a monk and a priest. So most monks cannot perform Mass, for example, or hear confession. Only a priest can do that. Nuns took similar vows, but were more strictly cloistered. Often female orders were poorer, and some were dependent on donations for the very food they ate. Both male and female convents had scriptoria, in which manuscripts were copied. Both male and female religious illuminated manuscripts. Now, that's general background. Now let me talk to you a little bit specifically about the use of the word Romanesque. we've said this before, but I want to repeat it. The use of Romanesque is a term that designates pre-Gothic art. And it's a relatively recent term. It came into being in the 19th century. Characteristics of Romanesque architecture include heavy masonry walls, clear articulation or separation of parts, usually round arches, usually masonry tunnel vaults, and small windows. Some Romanesque churches had no clerestory at all, as we'll see with these pilgrimage churches. And I should caution you that there are exceptions to every rule. Not every church has every one of these characteristics. But these characteristics, particularly the rounded arches and the heavy walls and the vaulting, they evidently reminded scholars of Roman art, which is the origin of the term Romanesque. However, you must remember there is no real connection with classical art other than perhaps some influence just because some buildings were still standing. Romanesque does not mean classical, and let me repeat that because a lot of times I have students that do that. They mean to say Roman or they mean to say classical and they say Romanesque. And that, of course, is a medieval art period of approximately 11th and 12th centuries. Indeed, most Romanesque sculpture is abstract in style, rather than illusionistic as classical art was. And of course, once again, there are occasional exceptions. We're going to see, for example, Rainier Hugh's baptismal font, which does have illusionistic and idealistic figure style. Now, you'll remember that we talked about the year 1000 when we talked about Ottonian art, and so I'm going to repeat that again. Around the year 1000, the first millennium, many people expected the end of the world, the second coming of Christ, and the last judgment. But the world didn't end, and new churches were built in gratitude to God. And of course, the very famous quotation, which you've heard before. Therefore, after the year of the millennium, which is now about 3 years past, so 1003, there occurred throughout the world, especially in Italy and Gaul, a rebuilding of church basilicas. It was as if the whole earth, having cast off the old by shaking itself, were clothing itself everywhere in the white robe of the church. And of course, this was a quotation from Raoul Glaber, a Cluniac monk of around 1003. Now, we quoted that for Ottonian architecture, but we've already seen that the earliest Romanesque architecture, the first Romanesque, also dates from the early 11th century. And so if it's outside the Ottonian Empire and it has these characteristics, we're talking about Romanesque art, such as St. Martin de Canuga and San Vicente at Cardona Castle. And you'll remember that Ottonian architecture shares some characteristics with Romanesque architecture, such as the articulation of parts that we saw at Hildesheim. But most Romanesque churches have the new development of masonry vaults rather than timber roofs, as at Hildesheim. And in contrast to the flat wall above the arcade level at Hildesheim, many, not all, many Romanesque churches have a gallery level, which is a second story above the side aisles, with arched openings into the nave. And so we're looking at the characteristics of Romanesque art. Here I've made a little list. We consider it to be an architecture of walls because it has very thick masonry walls. By masonry, we mean either stone or brick. And the windows are quite small. You have more walls, less openings. And then, of course, we've talked before about this articulation or separation of parts, how you can look at some of these churches and see exactly how they're laid out. Also, there's the equalization of horizontal and vertical elements. Now, it's not an absolute, but you will see more horizontal elements in Romanesque art than in the later style that we call Gothic, which is noted for its verticality. You'll have both in Romanesque art. And one of the things we're going to talk about next is the pilgrimage road churches, and these are very good examples of these characteristics of Romanesque art, as will be seen. Some of the things that you'll look for will be masonry vaulted ceilings. Generally, you have several types of vaulted ceilings. Tunnel vaults, which essentially, if you take an arch and extend it, it's a rounded vault, also sometimes called a barrel vault. And then groin vaults or cross vaults, which are essentially two tunnel vaults crossing at right angles. And we'll show you pictures of these as we go. As I've said, there are a few exceptions. In Italy, you'll find some churches that are Romanesque in most characteristics, but lack vaulted ceilings. It's different. Most Romanesque churches have rounded arches and rounded vaults. There are, however, in Burgundy, a few churches that have pointed arches, and we usually associate pointed arches with the Gothic style, so it's sort of a forerunner. It's where Gothic got the pointed arches, presumably. Now, why do I keep saying there are exceptions? Well, remember, there are regional differences. And so in one region, there will be perhaps different styles or different experiments. Nobody had a guidebook and said, you're going to create Romanesque art and you must do it this way. These were artisans who were experimenting. They were experimenting with new forms of construction and new styles. And so it's very exciting, actually. Let's look at the churches of the pilgrimage road. So I need to talk to you a little bit about what is a pilgrimage and what is a relic. Pilgrimages are journeys to a sacred site. And the sacred site we're going to be talking about primarily is Santiago de Compostela. But let me speak about pilgrimages in general first, and then specifically about the pilgrimage to Santiago. Pilgrimages are journeys to a sacred site, a place that is associated with a saint or with Christ. Usually the focus of devotion is a relic, or frequently many relics, or sometimes it might be a location in the life of Christ. Or the life of St. Peter, or someone very important. For example, in Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre, the church that was built over the tomb of Christ, the place of the resurrection, or the presumptive place of the resurrection, was a site of pilgrimage when people could get there. Now, during the Middle Ages, there were, of course, as you know, the Crusades, and there were periods when Christians controlled Jerusalem, but much larger periods when Islam controlled the sites of Jerusalem, which, of course, are holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So there were some periods when it was difficult to get to those sites. It was actually always difficult to get to Jerusalem. It was a very dangerous trip. It was always dangerous to go on any long trip. And so these pilgrimages, whether you're going to clear to Jerusalem or to Rome or to Spain, which is what we're going to talk about, could be quite daring. Now, we said that very often the churches that are sites for pilgrimage have relics. And relics are the physical remains of a saint, for example, the saint's bones. Or you can have what they call a secondary relic, something that was in contact with a sacred person. For example, pieces of the true cross, or the tunic of the Virgin. And it was believed that some of the power of the saint or holy person remained with these relics. So relics became the focus of devotion and of miracles. especially miracles of healing. Now, there's a lot of reasons that people go on pilgrimages. Pilgrimages were considered to be a good deed that earned merits toward salvation. Presumably because you're doing it in the right frame of mind for the right reasons, of course. Travel was often difficult and dangerous, and pilgrimages were taken as acts of penitence for sins, or as virtuous acts of devotion, or in hopes of being healed of illnesses or afflictions such as blindness or being lame. Or they could be taken in fulfillment of a vow. If something happens, then I will go on pilgrimage. Or even for the experience of travel and seeing new places. I suppose you could call it sacred tourism. And sometimes there are very specific reasons to go. For example, some crimes could be punished by sentencing the person to go on a pilgrimage to a certain site. If nothing else, it got the wrongdoer out of the territory in which he performed the wrong deed. And you could even at certain periods have proxy pilgrimages. A person could seek remission of sins for loved ones. For example, and this is in the 15th century, much later than we're talking about in this class, but in 1450, in the Jubilee year, the Pope declared that if you would go to Rome and make prayers and do certain things at sacred sites, you would receive indulgences. And the artist Roger van der Weyden went to Rome during the Jubilee year. We don't know, but there is some speculation that he may have gone not only for himself, but also because his daughter had recently died, and he may have been seeking indulgences for her. Just one example. Sometimes a wealthy person would pay someone else to go on pilgrimage. And they hoped that they would collect some of the merits of the pilgrimage by doing so, because they were putting up the money, they were sacrificing, they were financing someone else's good deed of going on the pilgrimage. And we mentioned that in the late Middle Ages, indulgences were granted for some pilgrimages. What is an indulgence? The definition is an indulgence is remission of temporal penalty for forgiven sins. But how it worked for most people, the way they would think of it, is if I do this good deed, I get time off from purgatory. I get into heaven sooner. Now, the three most important pilgrimage goals were Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Rome is the second one. And the third one is Santiago de Compostela. And of course, many countries, most countries, I want to say all, probably all, had numerous other popular pilgrimages. One you may have heard of course, is the pilgrims going to Canterbury, where they have the bones of, or had the bones of, St. Thomas à Becket. So that was an English pilgrimage. But the one we're going to talk about is the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Santiago is Saint James. Iago is James in Spanish. And Compostela means the field of stars. It is related to a vision of discovery of the body. A monk said that he followed a field of stars to the place where he found the tomb of the saint. And some people suggest that the field of stars refers to the Milky Way. So the relic that was in this site in northwestern Spain, the relic was the relic of St. James, the apostle, the disciple of Christ. And as you can see from this plan, and as you can see from this map, there were 4 primary roads going through France, different routes, to Santiago. And when they would get to the Pyrenees, there were 2 passes. As you can see, 3 of these roads meet up, and the other one takes a different pass through the Pyrenees. And then they meet up in northern Spain, and there is one single road for the last part of the journey. Incidentally, this is not something that's dead and gone. People still make pilgrimages to Santiago. Sometimes for the same reasons, and sometimes for ideas of devotion, and sometimes just because they want to experience something that the medieval pilgrims did. Perhaps their stopping places on the way might be a little more comfortable, and certainly they didn't have to worry as much about some of the difficulties of the danger, such as robbers preying on the pilgrims or directing them to poison springs where the horses would die. And these tales were told in a kind of guidebook, which was included in the Book of St. James, or the Liber Sancti Jacobi, by a monk named Picaud, Picaud. And a lot of the things we know about the pilgrimage comes from this guidebook and other written works that tell us about the experiences of the pilgrims. Now, when the pilgrims went to Santiago, they weren't going only to Santiago. All along these roads were churches with relics. And of course, many of the monastic churches wanted to acquire relics because a lot of their funding would come from gifts that the pilgrims left. And so this had a very big economic impact on the medieval world. I think it probably still has a big impact on Santiago, because as I say, the pilgrimages are still going on. If your relic had miracles attached to it, this would attract more pilgrims and attract more donations, and they became a major source of revenue for these monasteries that owned the relics. And so as the pilgrim goes from site to site, he's exposed to and pays devotion to the various saints, the various relics, tries to find healing, tries to do penance, the various reasons that people go on pilgrimage. Now, in the late 11th century, we start to see building campaigns for major churches along the pilgrimage routes. And so we find that the style of Languedoc, which is the southern France, the area around Toulouse, controlled by the Counts of Toulouse, and the styles of northern Spain, Santiago, they're very similar styles. And you'll notice a great deal of similarities between these pilgrimage churches that we're talking about. We believe that not only pilgrims moved up and down the pilgrimage roads, but also artisans, master masons, other people who were working in the building trades would go to wherever they're building, and they would train new workers, and then either they or the workers that they train become masters, and they go to another site. And of course, the influence of the previous buildings are passed on. In some cases, art historians have identified styles of artists and have suggested that that the master, for example, at Cluny, trained someone who was working there, who then became the master at the church at Vézelay, and one of his assistants became a master, and this was Giselbertus, who worked at Autun. And then we see work that is either from Giselbertus' workshop or possibly an assistant, possibly he himself, which you can find now, actually, some capitals at the Fogg Museum of Art at Harvard. There is You might run across this sometimes when you're reading about this old question, which is essentially framed in the words Spain or Toulouse. And the question is, which came first? Santiago, the church at Santiago in Spain, or the church of St. Sernin in Toulouse, because they're very, very similar buildings. They were built at very closely to the same time. And they have, as you'll see, a lot of different similarities. I'm not sure whether people fret about that anymore. I did find a reference that said they thought that maybe Toulouse started just a little bit before Santiago, but we're talking about approximate dates anyway, and they're very, very close. So they're virtually going on at the same time, whether one started a year before the other or not. A year or 5 before the other or not. We think that the same masons and sculptors probably worked at both Santiago and Toulouse, or at least their workshops. And some of these major churches of Languedoc and northern Spain that we'll be talking about are Saint-Foy at Conques, St. Sernin at Toulouse, Santiago of Compostela, or de Compostela. They're all very, very similar in plan and elevation, although Toulouse was the most elaborate, with double side aisles and a larger size. And I should mention something. A lot of times when we're talking about these churches, we don't completely give the entire dedication. We start saying, for example, Toulouse, meaning St. Sernin. Actually, there are other significant medieval churches in Toulouse, but this is the one we're going to be talking about in this class. And you'll find that we do this not just for Romanesque churches, but for example, when we get to the Gothic, we'll talk about Chartres and Amiens and Lyon and different churches by the name. Because that's what we're talking about, cathedrals at that time or churches, and so it's understood that we're talking about the church, the very famous, important church there. I might mention something then, because it just occurred to me to point this out. Most of the churches that we're going to be talking about for the Romanesque period are monasteries or abbeys. In the Gothic period, you're going to have many that are the bishop's church or the cathedral. It's not an absolute. Obviously, they're building churches that are not cathedrals in the Gothic period. And there are churches in the Romanesque period, parish churches and things like that. But the wealth that is needed to erect these churches is sometimes centered either in the rich monasteries or the wealthy bishops in wealthy towns in the Gothic period. Let's get back to Santiago. Now, you'll notice that I am showing you a drawing of the Church of Santiago. It's sort of an aerial view, which of course the pilgrimage were not able to see an aerial view. Incidentally, there is on the web a lecture. You'll notice that I'm showing you a drawing of Santiago de Compostela, because I can't show you a photograph of the Romanesque church. The church has been rebuilt over the centuries. Today, the west facade is a Baroque building built in the early 18th century. We do have photographs of the inside, though. But the exterior has been greatly changed. So when we want to talk about the Romanesque church, we have to show you a reconstruction. And so that's what we're looking at. Now, as you look at this, you'll notice that you can see in the drawing, if you could have a bird's eye view of the Romanesque church, you can see very clearly the different parts, and you can see very clearly that it is a cross-shaped or cruciform plan. And you see also the plan here. Now, we use that term cruciform to mean any cross-shaped church. And These are in the Latin West, and they are Latin cross plans. A Latin cross has a long section, sort of like where the body of Christ would be, and then shorter arms. And you may remember from Byzantine art that a Greek cross has equal arms. All four sections are equal in size. So this is a Latin cross plan. And you'll notice that if you were to enter at the west end, you could go straight down the nave, but you could also go into the side aisles. And the side aisles go completely down and around the transept, and then around the apse, which by this time, we're not just saying apse, we also sometimes use the word choir, which is the apse with all of the additions to it, the ambulatory, and these radiating chapels, which radiate or extend off of the ambulatory of the choir. And then you can also see we have coming off of the transept on each side, two chapels, which form kind of semicircles. Now, why are they doing this? Well, one of the reasons is traffic flow. Remember, we've got lots of tourists coming, lots of pilgrims coming. And so, they could completely fill up this church. What if you're saying, Mass? Well, if there was someone saying Mass at the high altar, the pilgrims could walk around the side aisles and completely go around the whole church without going into the nave or at all. And they could also stop at these altars, which would be placed in the chapels, which would also contain relics. So we're seeing extra space for walking, and extra space to house relics, additional chapels in which there would be placed an altar, and every altar had to have a relic to found it. And also, this is where the priests would celebrate daily Mass. And if you did have a lot of priests connected to the church, they all have to say Mass, so they need more altars. It's also for the benefit of the pilgrims. Maybe somebody arrives, at early in the morning or in the middle of the day or late in the afternoon. And so, it would be useful for them to be able to go to Mass at different times. And here we see a picture of the outside, once again, a drawing, and a cross-section of the inside. And you see those characteristics of the separation of parts. Incidentally, the end of the south transept, this portal, we will look at that. They didn't include it in your textbook, the second edition. It is in the first edition. But I'm going to show you that anyway. And then you can see the cross-section, and maybe you can't make that out quite clearly, but what you're seeing is a row of arcades at the ground level, and then a second story that we call a gallery above it. And then those straight lines are the transverse arches that go across the vaulting. So you're not seeing any clerestory. It's the vault itself. Let's look at a picture of the church. This was erected between approximately 1075 and 1120. So a good date just to remember for these churches is circa 1100. And then remember, it's a little bit before they started and a little bit after that they finish. And of course, people do keep making additions and changes to these churches. When you look down the nave, you'll see that there is a vast tunnel vault, this rounded vault that extends down the nave. And then when you look at the wall, you see a two-part elevation. That means there's two stories. One is the arcade level, the arches on the ground level, And then the second story, if being Americans, we can say second story rather than first story, which you would say in Europe. But the level above the arcade is the gallery. And you can go up there and walk around that too. And as you can see, there are arched openings that look into the nave. And then there's no clerestory. There's no window level. Directly from above the arcade, you see the vault springing up. We talk about the springing of the vault, the point where the wall and the vault meet. And from if you look back on the wall, you will see these shafts or colonnettes that rise up. At the arcade level, you have a pier with columns on the different sides. They're engaged columns, what we call a compound pier or a composite pier. And then on the side that faces the nave, one of these rises up. They call it either a colonnette or a shaft, rises up to the springing of the vault where there's another capital. That divides the interior of the church into sections that we call bays. And from the springing of the vault, also dividing the ceiling into bays, we see the transverse arch rises up, crosses over, strengthens the ceiling. On the outside, there would have been very, very thick walls or buttresses. And this divides the church into sections that we call bays. And you can see also that kind of both horizontal and vertical elements. The vertical element of the colonnettes. And then you can see this molding or string course that goes down horizontally. And then even just the band of the gallery and of the arcade can be thought of as a horizontal that's broken by vertical, sort of equalizing them. Now, if you don't have a clerestory, that means it is going to be darker inside. It's going to be shadowy. The light that comes in is going to filter through the side aisles. There's windows in the side aisles. And also there would be light coming in from both the east end and presumably also the west end. They would have windows piercing the entrance end, the west end, and piercing the wall over the altar, the choir or apse end at the east. But I don't want you to think of these as drab and dreary. It may have been shadowy inside, but these churches were decorated. They were painted very vivid colors, and they were adorned with reliquaries that may have been in gold or silver or enamel with jewels. There would have been beautiful vestments, beautiful cloths on the altars. There would have been candlelight, which would make the interiors perhaps mysterious in a sense. You know, a little flickering candlelight in a fairly shadowy space. And there would have been incense burning. And at certain times, monks would be chanting the Gregorian chant, which would reverberate off of these tunnel vaults. You may remember we suggested that there were a number of reasons to create a vault. One, of course, was just the figuring out how to do something new, the technical knowledge, maybe aesthetic reasons, but also fire safety, stone's less likely to burn than wood, and the reverberations of the choir, and these would be Gregorian chants, plain song, by which we mean there's no musical accompaniment, at least at most of the Middle Ages. And this would reverberate off the vaults. Here is a diagram, a drawing, which shows the same points very clearly, that you have an arcade, you have a gallery, you have the shafts rising up to the transverse arches that go over. And so you see that breaks up that barrel vault and divides it into bays or sections. And here we're looking from the side aisles into the nave and standing just outside the western facade and looking down the nave. We'll come back and talk about that sculpture later. But it's a little bit later sculpture. So I want to talk about some Romanesque sculpture created just about the time they were building this church. The problem is that it's not the way it originally was. You remember that we said that there was a Baroque facade that was put up in the 18th century. However, that was not the only time they changed things. They believe that the carved blocks that you're seeing here on this wall were arranged or rearranged at least 6 times between 1130 and the 20th century. So some of the blocks may have been taken from other places and put here. And it's hard to tell how the original facade looked. But this does have the surviving Romanesque sculpture that's on the exterior of the building. Inside they have, of course, capitals of the columns that are Romanesque. It's known as the Puerta de las Platerías, which means the portal of the silversmiths. Presumably were the donors. And it is on the south portal, the end of the transept. And as you can see, it has 2 archways that are the 2 sets of doors. And they have over the doorway in this arch spaces that we call tympana. One is a tympanum, 2 are tympanae. There is carving. We're going to look at those. And then up above, there are more blocks with sculpture on, and I only have a detail of one of those areas. First, let's talk about some terminology. Tympana, trumeau, and jambs are the ones that I'll be using the most. But we have a diagram here. And you see some terms. The archivolts are the moldings around the arch. The voussoirs are these wedge-shaped stones that create the arch. You can't just put straight blocks in. They have to be shaped like a wedge or you won't have an arch. And of course, the top one is called the keystone. And then below that is the horizontal member, the lintel, which is the horizontal beam that goes between the supports. And above the lintel, there is a semicircular space that we call the tympanum. And in many, many churches, many Romanesque and Gothic churches, the tympana become primary places to put sculpture. Between the doorways is a central doorpost that's called the trumeau. And on either side, there are vertical elements that are called the jambs, the door jambs. And sometimes you will have figures or carvings on the trumeau and the jambs, and on the voussoir, and in the tympana. I should tell you that as long as the textbook does not put this in, I will not be testing you on these particular sculptures. But I thought it would be interesting. And so, those of you who aren't interested, I guess you can fast forward. Those of you who are interested, I had never seen these, or rather, I've never been there, but I've never seen pictures of these except these little terrible black and white photographs that you could barely make out anything. And when I was preparing my lecture, I found on the internet some very good pictures that were many pixels, could be blowing up. And so that's what I'm using here. And I got to see for the first time the sculpture over the doorways of the Puerta de las Platerías. Well, I thought that was pretty exciting. One of the things you have to understand is they don't have a big flat piece of stone up there, a big wall that the sculptor climbs up a ladder and starts carving away. These are made out of blocks that are carved on the ground and then are hoisted up and put together, I guess, like a jigsaw puzzle. Of course, they should be all planned out. And that's one of the things that you can see here. Sometimes there are little figures that just seem to be stuck in, and we think they may have been taken from someplace else and fitted in one of those many reconstructions, tearing apart, rebuilding of the churches. And we have this diagram here just of a generic tympana showing you all the different blocks that go together to make up the voussoirs, the tympana, and the lintels. So we think that some of these blocks may have been rearranged. We think that some of the blocks may have come from some other part of the church and been cut to fit. We can't be sure what this originally looked like. But here we're looking at the doorway on the left as we face it. And in the center, you do see a scene of the temptation of Christ. And we'll look at a little detail of that in a moment. But I just want to point out a few things. There are some heads here that are just seen to be stuck in. And those are some of the kind of figures that we say, where do they come from? What are they doing? Are they just brought from somewhere else and put in? There's also this very strange figure of the woman down here in the lower right, and we'll talk about her later. We're going to look a little closer. And here we see Christ with the devil. Devils. Of course, in the Bible, it talks about Satan tempting Christ, but here they have amplified that. Not just Satan, but he brought his whole crew, it seems. And we can see perhaps some of the treasures of the earth with which Christ is being tempted. And there's an angel flying in. And we also have over here a detail of some more of the devils that came along with Satan. And you can see, of course, that a lot of these pieces are in bad shape. Parts of them have been destroyed, such as the heads of those devils. As I said, they're multiplying. It's not just the one that's mentioned in the Bible, but a lot of evil here is shown on the tympana. And devils are shown as monstrous beings. In other words, creatures that are made up of parts of different animals that are put together, that God didn't make them that way. They are monsters against nature, against God, essentially. And then I wanted to show you that very strange image of a woman who seems to be partially naked, holding a skull in her lap. Okay, who is she? Well, the Pilgrim's Guide in the Liber Sancti Jacobi, the Book of St. James, which was written about 1139 to 1152, tells us a story about this. He says that the story is that this is an image of a woman who is holding a skull because she was an adulterous woman, and she's holding the skull of her lover, the idea that sin results in death. But that seems really odd. Why would you put that in a tympana? And you have to remember that the church had already undergone some reconstruction as early as about 1130. So it's possible that some of the blocks were taken from one place and rearranged and stuck together. And that's what Picard saw. And where did he get the story? Locals? Tour guides, maybe? I have to admit that sounds to me like the kind of story a tour guide makes up. And I have been to Europe, and I've heard these stories that the guides are telling people that just make me cringe because they aren't true. They're just making them up for effect, and they like to have some scandalous story, that they can come up, or whatever they made up, that they think sounds good. So if they're still doing it in the 20th century, hey, people could have been doing it in the 12th century as well, seeing an image and making up a story to go with it. I can't tell you that I know what she means, but one of the possibilities is that this could be Eve holding the skull of Adam. Adam was supposed to have been buried at the site of Golgotha, where Christ was crucified. And if you look at paintings of the crucifixions, you very often will see a skull at the bottom, not just because Golgotha is the place of the skull, but because it is the site of Adam's burial, and that is the skull of Adam, and Christ is redeeming all of Adam's children, all of mankind. I don't know why Eve would be holding a skull, though. That's just another possibility. Maybe it's some kind of allegorical figure. And maybe there's some story we don't have any idea of. It's very difficult to tell what she could mean because she may not be in her original context. I mean, what's she doing there seated next to the temptation of Christ right behind all these devils? So it could be that the block has been taken from someplace else in part of another story. So the answer to that question is we don't really know what she is. Let's look at the next one. This one has some scenes that I've been trying to figure out what they are, and I'm just doing it by looking at them. And I'm not always sure. But as you see in the lower center, we can see a flagellation of Christ. So there is the detail with Christ being tied to the column. And the soldiers, the bad guys, are getting ready to whip him. Parts of the whips have probably been broken off. You might notice that these figures are kind of short and stubby with pretty big heads. They're telling the story, and they're trying to fit them into the architecture. If you're on the edge, you might be leaning over or really small or something like that. And these were two other scenes that I was able to get details with. The one above, and I'm just looking at this and trying to figure out what it is. We see Mary and the Christ child very, very badly damaged, as you can see. There seems to be an angel flying in and some kneeling figures and what looks like a sunburst or a rosette between them. And I wonder if that's supposed to be the Star of Bethlehem. And the kneeling figures perhaps are either the Magi or the shepherds. So this might be an adoration of the Magi, the question mark after it. And then next to it you see this angel who's headed straight down. He's holding something. I wondered if it could be a wreath. And then we have an image with Christ and three men. And I'm going, well, what could that be? It could be Christ and three apostles. It could be maybe Christ on the way to Emmaus, but I think there were two. Or maybe it's the arrest of Christ. They seem to be grabbing hold of him. And then what's that angel doing? Is that angel supposed to be part of the scene? Is it the angels looking down to the men? And that reminds me of the Ascension, where Christ goes up into heaven and the angels look down and say, "Men of Galilee, why are you looking up? Don't you know that Christ will come again as he went?" But Christ is still on the ground. So is it the mission of the apostles just before the Ascension? Or is that angel utterly irrelevant, that it's just a figure that's come from some other scene? Maybe a crowning of the Virgin Mary, or a crowning of a saint, or a crowning of one of the blessed. They've stuck it in this space. They've cut it to fit. We don't know. It's a hard puzzle, and probably one that's not completely answerable. And then on the jambs, we have some images. And as you can see, this is a somewhat different style. These are these very elongated images. What we're looking at, first I have a scene where you can see carving on the door jamb. Some are columns, and some on the wall adjacent are figural images. And this elongated guy with his crossed legs, he seems to have a musical instrument with a bow. It looks kind of like not exactly like a violin, but something like that. Presumably it's a lyre or a harp, because this is King David, who is wearing a crown, and he is the author of the Psalms, so he is often shown with a musical instrument, usually a harp. but sometimes perhaps a more contemporary instrument. And we also see Adam and Eve, once again, these very elongated figures. They fit the shape of the jambs. You know, you've got long vertical elements. They fit the wall right beside it, so they're long and thin. You'll find that in the Romanesque period, sculpture is usually subordinate to architecture. So in other words, you fit the figures in. If you've got a long, thin space, you make the figures long and thin. If you've got a short, stubby space, you make the figures short and stubby. So they'll fit the architecture. And we'll see in the Gothic how that changes. And then this pose where David has his legs crossed. That is a pose we're going to see again in Romanesque sculpture. Okay, now we're going to look at something that is a bit more intact. If you are a pilgrim coming to Santiago, you will go up the stairs and through the western doors of the west facade. And that's what we're looking at here. And as you can see, these are very richly sculpted. And the style is more natural. Well, that's because they are later. And this is called the Portica del Gloria, the Portal of Glory. And we do have the name of the artist, his master Matthew. You'll find that we do not always have last names until very late in the Middle Ages, actually. Sometimes you have family names for the rulers that develop. But, you know, people might know him as Matthew the Mason or Matthew from wherever he came from. So he's in the records as Master Matthew. And as you can see, this is a bit later in the century, 1168 to 88. And you can see how the style is changing. At this period, if you were in the Ile-de-France, the area around Paris, you would now be into the early Gothic period. But here we are far away in Spain. And yet you can see that the figure has become much more naturalistic, much more believable, and that he's not, the figure on the trumeau is Christ, and he's not subject to being stretched out or squished in. He's actually almost he is a separate statue that is attached to the trumeau. He sticks out. And now we're going to go to Saint Sernin in Toulouse. This is in southern France, in Languedoc. The word means the tongue of gold, the golden language. And this was ruled by the Counts of Toulouse, and at a certain amount of time, the Dukes of Aquitaine were also the Counts of Toulouse. The church was built from around 1070 to 1096 when the choir was finished, and it was dedicated by Pope Urban II. But it wasn't completely finished then. They think that what was probably finished was the choir, the eastern end, the transept, and the bays that were closest to the transept. And the rest of the nave and the facade continued to be built until about 1118. So let's look at this church. Once again, you're looking down at the church, and you can see very clearly that it is a Latin cross plan. And you can see the various parts, and we're going to talk about these, of course, specifically. First thing I want to point out, though, is it's very, very, very similar to Santiago. Now, Santiago didn't have that crossing tower, but as we look at it, you can see a lot of the similarities. The cross-shaped plan, the separation of parts, the narthex, the chapels that extend out of the transepts and out of the choir, the apse. And that's really apparent when you look at the plan. Okay, what's different? Well, there's a couple of things different. One is that St. Sernin is much larger, and another is it's a bit more elaborate. You'll notice that at Santiago there is a single side aisle that goes completely around the church. So there's one side aisle on either side of the nave. But St. Sernin has what we call double side aisles. There's 4 altogether, 2 on either side of the nave. So, when you come in, you can go down the nave or you can go into either of these 2 side aisles. And then when you reach the transept, there is a single side aisle that continues around the ambulatory, which is the place that goes around the altar end, the apse. And then, of course, as you see, you can continue down. So it's like even more room, even extra room. It also has radiating chapels and chapels coming off the transept, which are called echelon chapels, but you don't have to worry about that term. And then when we look inside, the naves are virtually identical. You have your arcade, surmounted by the gallery, the tunnel vault, no clerestory, and the colonnettes that rise up. Is it any wonder that they think that masons from the same workshop, maybe even the same people, worked at both churches? Now, the facade was never finished. And as you can see, there are buttresses that today they look like vertical elements on either side of this center section. And the buttresses were to be the base, the foundation for facade towers. But the facade towers were never built. There is a double doorway. It may remind you a little bit of the Puerto de las Plateras at Santiago. And above that, there is a kind of arcade with 5 different rounded arches. And above there is a rose window. Now, I have been trying to find out. In my notes, it just said that this was a later Gothic addition. And you can see that it's in a kind of pointed blind arcade or arch, just a recessed section, or maybe built out a little bit, I should say. So I have not been able to find out definitively what they say. My guess would be that the round window, the rose window, would be a later addition. It's very unusual for one of these round windows in the facade that they call rose windows, and we'll hear that with the Gothic period, that it does not have any tracery or stonework. It's just glass. And that would be really odd. I can't even imagine it, that much glass. So that is definitely not part of what was originally intended. But we've got our very thick, massive walls, and we've got rounded arches. And now you see it from an oblique angle, and we want to look down on the aerial view again. Once again, you have this cruciform cross plan, Latin cross, very clear articulation of parts. You can see the narthex and the transept crossing over. You can see that the nave is the highest part, but there's no clerestory there. And then you can see, as you look at the nave, the 2 side aisles. One is taller than the other, but you only have the one at the transept level. And of course, you have these chapels, these semicircles or cylinders that radiate out. And once again, it all looks like parts that have been put together very, very clearly articulated. The crossing tower was begun in the Romanesque period. So the first 3 levels are rounded arches. And then when you get to the top 2, they are Gothic. They are pointed arches. And then the spire on top was actually 15th century, so very late Gothic. Churches take a long time to build. And sometimes you run out of money, or there's a war or some horrible thing happens, famine, whatever, and you stop building for a while. Sometimes you take it up again. Sometimes, as you can see from the facade, you don't. And now we want to look at the side. And you can see the cylindrical shapes of the chapels. And you might notice that when you look both at the nave and the side aisles, and you look at the apse end, that you have these rounded windows with rounded arches above them, in the case of the decoration of the apse end. But they're relatively small windows in relationship to lots of wall, and a very thick wall. As you can see, the windows are set back in. You also see these buttresses that jut out between the windows. Sometimes they're just little engaged columns, perhaps decoration, a little bit more support, as we see here with the apse. But if you look at the lower side aisle, you have pretty thick buttresses sticking out. And these correspond to the same place inside that you have the transverse arch going over. So you can see the bays on the outside as well as on the inside. And here we look very close with the exterior side, round arcade and gallery level windows, relatively small with very thick walls, and that equalization of horizontal and verticals. The buttresses go up, so they're vertical. But at the roof line, this gives us a horizontal elements, a repetition of the various roof lines, and they're accentuated by a series of corbel tables, or these little arches at the eaves. And here, once again, we see the apse with the radiating chapels, this repetition of these cylindrical curving shapes. Also see all of those parts when you look at the plan. Now, we're going to look down the nave. Tunnel vault, transverse arches that rise from colonnettes that rise from the floor up. And these colonnettes and transverse arches divide the church into the bays. Once again, it's the two-part elevation with a gallery and an arcade, and no clerestory at all. And here you can see it in a diagram. And here, a closer look at the tunnel vault. There's another term for transverse arches. Sometimes they're called transverse arches because they transverse or go across the vault. Sometimes they're called diaphragm arches. The idea, I guess, is that like your diaphragm supports your lungs, they are supporting the ceiling. And certainly you see this wonderful rhythm of the repetition of the forms, and also how clearly each section is separated or articulated. Here we see another view where you can see just the top of the arcade and the gallery and the looking up into the vault. Let's look in the side aisles. Side aisles have a different kind of vaulting. It's called a groin vault. And as you can see, it looks kind of like a meeting of concave triangles. And here's a little diagram to show you. If you were to take a tunnel vault or a barrel vault, they're the same thing, just two different words for the same thing, and cross them at right angles, you would have a groin vault. And you can see it here, looking down, which of course you'd have to be inside the ceiling to do that, but also looking up, which was what we just saw. A cross-section can articulate this a little bit better. You can see here this very large nave, and then on either side you have the side aisle with the gallery over it, and then you have the other side aisle, that second side aisle. And all of this, of course, has lots of stonework, which is actually helping to support those heavy vaults with these very thick walls. I want to talk to you about the sculpture at St. Sernin. This is the beginning of Romanesque sculpture that actually survives. And we have a kind of documentation because the original altar still exists. And on the edge, it is decorated with relief sculpture. You can see here a little roundel with Christ and two flying angels. It may remind you of some of the motifs that we see on early Christian sarcophagi. And that may be it. That maybe he has seen some kind of survival from late antiquity. The edge of the altar also has an inscription, and it names the sculptor. It says, Bernardus Gueldinus me fecit, which means Bernard Gueldin made me, somebody that actually has two names. And here you see the, this is actually from a photograph of a replica, but you can see his name started out Bernardus, and you can just see the beginning of Gueldinus. And so they've taken a non-Latin name, Bernard Gueldin, and made it Latin just by adding US at the end. It also tells us that the altar was consecrated in 1096. If I remember correctly, it was May 24th, and it was consecrated by Pope Urban II. Now, we have this little example of the style, which, as you can, of the style of the artist. But we also have some other sculpture that's relief sculpture that seems to be the same style. So either the same artist or his workshop. And these are 7 reliefs. They're quite shallowly cut, but 7 reliefs. And today they are set into the wall of the ambulatory, which is not the original placement. There is a Christ in Majesty. There's 2 small angels holding scrolls. There's 2 large angels holding crosses that are long, so they almost like staffs. And then there are 2 saints. Some people call them apostles. Some people think they're other saints, such as Saint Sernin, perhaps. But they're 2 saints who hold books, and they are blessing. And we'll look at most of these. First, we want to look at the sculpture of Christ. The subject is the Majestas Domini, the majesty of the Lord, or you could just say Christ in majesty. It shows Christ in heaven, surrounded by a mandorla. A mandorla means almond. It's an almond-shaped body halo. And the tetramorph. Of course, we've talked about them before. These are the 4 living creatures that in the book of Revelation and in the vision of Ezekiel, these 4 living creatures surround the throne of God, the throne of the One, and sing Sanctus, 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 holy, holy, holy. And they are a winged man, i.e. an angel, a winged lion, a winged ox, and an eagle, which is naturally winged. And they have come, of course, to represent the 4 evangelists, the 4 writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so when you have these heavenly scenes of Christ, they often reflect the description of heaven from the Bible. I want to look at the style of this. The style, as we said, is very similar to the style that you see on that little relief on the edge of the altar, and we do believe it's by the same sculptor whose name is Gueldin or Gueldinus. And this has been called the plaque style because they are low relief, and although they are stone sculpture, they seem to be based on imagery from Carolingian and Ottonian manuscripts and book covers. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute, but first I want to just describe the style. We see these figures who have these heavy, rounded jaws. They've got broad, stubby proportions with large heads, hands, and feet, and the forms are very blocky. They're almost like rounded off rectangles. They usually are enclosed. In the case of Christ, he's enclosed in a mandorla. We'll see the saints and the angels are enclosed within an arch. And the only thing that breaks through those enclosures is Christ's hand, as you can see, comes out in front of the mandorla, and his feet sort of rest on the bottom. Now, the style is said to reflect late antique art that would have been in Roman Gaul. And so it's possible that they had seen some antique sarcophagi or other statues, but also where we think that there is possible influence is from Carolingian and Ottonian ivories. And I found this ivory showing Christ in majesty. It's from the Ottonian period, somewhere between 1000 and 1100. And it shows many of the same characteristics. Christ is pretty much in almost exactly the same pose, with the blessing gesture and the hand extending over the edge of the mandorla. Gualdinus brings the hand up even further out. And Christ is holding the book, resting it on one knee. And, of course, we see the mandorla. Instead of the living creatures, the tetramorph, we see the four evangelists, which is more frequently the way that that's shown in Byzantine art. So it's quite probable an influence from Byzantine art on the Ottonian art. And you'll remember that there was influence coming in. Otto II even married a Byzantine princess. But one of the things about using an ivory book cover as your model would account for the somewhat flattened or plaque-like forms of Gualdinus' style. And you can also see this iconography in Ottonian manuscripts with the mandorla, Christ in majesty, and blessing with one hand, holding a book with the other. But in the cases of these examples, we have the tetramorph, the four living creatures, in the corners, or in the other roundel on the right. Or in the other manuscript image, there are roundels with the evangelist symbols. But the four living creatures are more frequent in Western art to surround the throne of God. Okay, what does this mean? It means that what Gualdinus is doing is very innovative. We believe that the large-scale architectural sculpture had died out after the end of the Carolingian Empire, because with such unstable times when the empire is breaking up, would preclude such luxuries as building monumental churches. With the post-millennium building revival, from the Ottonian and the Romanesque period, when they want to decorate the churches now. So where are you going to get your sculptors? Well, they think that they may have come from two different kind of backgrounds. One is stonemasons, people who actually know how to carve the stone. But they would also have to learn to do sculpture in stone. And the other might be workers in precious ivories and metals. So it's possible that they could be designing these things, and the people who actually work the stone could be executing them, or, could be looking at the models of manuscripts or book plaques, which may have been shown to them by the patron, by the abbot, for example. We think then that the models from the decorative art, book covers, manuscript images, were translated into stone and into the architectural setting. It's believed that all of these images that we're looking at, we're going to look at a few more, were by the same workshop, or even possibly the same hand, the same artist, who's called Gualdinus, or Gualdine, probably him anyway. We don't know where they were originally placed. Today, they are simply set in the wall of the ambulatory. But we know that that's not the original location. And, we don't know where they were set. There's been a whole lot of reconstructions. One, I'm just going to real quickly read these off. Possibly originally on the pier of a cloister, or in tympana or reliefs in the jambs, or perhaps on a facade with reliefs over the doorway, or in the spandrels. These are sort of the corners, if you will, above arched portals, the spandrels above the portals. Or maybe they were an entirely different place. Maybe they were part of a altarpiece, a retable, or an antependium for the altar, maybe on the front of the altar. Or maybe they could have been on a choir screen, or a tomb, or a portal to the crypt, or a shrine in the crypt. I mean, you can keep going on and on and on. I should tell you something about the crypt at St. Sernin. I was there in 1970. And at the time I was there, you could not get down into the crypt. But it was pointed out to me that there was a sign in Latin that said, "This is the most holy place on earth," or the most sacred place on earth. Presumably because they had so many relics, but they were down there in the crypt and I couldn't get to them. So I suspect with the medieval travelers would get down into the crypt and be able to see all of the 128 relics that St. Sernin is said to possess. So let's just look at these. We have here one of the angels, and once again this kind of flattened plaque style with heavy jaws, very regular patterning of the wings of the angel. And you'll notice how the angel's head is turned to one side, but he's pointing the opposite direction. So that gives you a little bit of movement, going both ways at once, as it were. And here you have another one of the large angels and one of the small angels who's holding the scroll. And here is that angel again with a detail. You'll notice that the hair of the angels looks rather like a cap and has the same kind of scale-like patterning that the angel wings do. You might also notice how the drapery folds are created. Oftentimes there are two parallel grooves with a rounded section between them. They're trying various patterns to create the effect of drapery folds. And here we have the very frontal saints who are blessing and holding their books, presumably their gospel books. But there's a little variety. They're not just identical. As you can see, one flexes his knee a little bit, and the features are just slightly different, which we'll see as we look at details. So here you see him. And do notice those sort of parallel grooves that make up drapery patterns. And here you see how very shallow and here you see how very shallow the relief is. It seems to extend out like there's a half a figure